This is Pamchuila Bhutia, Assistant Professor of Philosophy at Sonada Degree College, Sonada. This lecture series is made available to you by Radio Salesian 90.8 FM. Today I will be teaching on Kant's Categorical Imperative, which is a part of the syllabus of DSc Paper 4 Western Ethics Semester 4 and CC Paper 4 Ethics Semester 2. So this lecture is for those students who have opted for philosophy as one of the subjects in BA program and BA Honours under North Bengal University. Now, Immanuel Kant is a German philosopher born in 1724. He falls in the school of the Ontological Ethics. His ethics is the ontological approach to morality, placing duty as the highest ethical order. The morality of an action is based on whether that action itself is wrong or right, rather than based on consequences or result of the action. Kant first argues that an action has moral worth if it is done for the sake of duty. If an action is done out of self-inclination, it has no moral worth. Secondly, Kant argues that an action to be right does not depend on the consequence of the action, but the motive of the person carrying out the action. So from here we can say two things about the ontologies. First, they are duty based, and second, for them consequences do not matter. And Kant belonged to this school of the ontological ethics. So throughout this lecture, let's keep this thing in mind that Kant is a deontologist, and for him action is duty based and consequences do not matter for him. Now, what is an imperative? An imperative is something which we must do. There are two types of imperative, hypothetical imperative and categorical imperative. The first one is hypothetical imperative. Something which we must do in order to achieve something. This kind of imperatives are hypothetical imperative. It comes with a condition. Let's take one example to understand this hypothetical imperative. Study hard if you want to get good marks in the examination. Here, to get good marks in the examination, the condition is to study hard. So all types of hypothetical imperative comes with a condition. Now the second type of imperative is categorical imperative. Categorical imperatives are those which we must always do, no matter what the situation is, no matter what we want to achieve. Example is, we should not steal. Here, we should not steal, no matter what the situation is, no matter what we want to achieve. So these are the two types of imperative, hypothetical and categorical. But since our class today is on categorical imperative, I shall continue with categorical imperative. One of Kant's work on moral philosophy is Groundwork of the Metaphysics of Morals, which I will refer as groundwork. He derived categorical imperative from the concept of duty. Categorical imperative are principles that are intrinsically valid. They are good in themselves and of themselves. They must be obeyed in all circumstances and all situations. According to him, to determine what is right, we have to use reason. It does not matter whether we want to be moral or not. The moral law is abiding on all of us. Morality is a constant for Kant. In Groundwork, Kant enumerated three formulations of the categorical imperative. They are principle of universality, principle of the formula of N, and principle of the formula of autonomy. So first let us see principle of universality in detail. It says, I quote, act only on that maxim through which you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. Let me repeat. Act only on that maxim through which you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. Let us take 2 examples to understand this more. The first example is the act of stealing food to feed the poor. Now here, stealing is the action or the act. Now the principle of universality says we should only act in a way where we would want everyone else in the world to act in the same way. Here, the question is, do we want everyone in the world stealing? The answer is no. It is impermissible. We do not want everyone in the world to be stealing. It cannot be universalized. Therefore, the action of stealing is morally wrong for everyone. What would happen if everyone starts stealing? If my action can cause contradiction in my will, then when universalized, then these are actions which we should not be doing. Moral acts should not cause contradiction. Now, the second example is speaking the truth. Here, speaking the truth is the action or the act. Now, the principle of universality says we should only act in a way where we would want everyone else in the world to act in the same way. The question here is, do we want everyone in the world speaking the truth? The answer is yes, it is permissible. It can be universalized. Therefore, the act of speaking the truth is morally right. If speaking the truth is morally right for me, it is morally right for everyone. In these 2 examples, I'm trying to explain the principle of universality. The first example was stealing food to feed the poor. Now, this action, since the principle says we should act only on those maxims which we want to be universalized, now we should ask whether we want everyone to be stealing. So, if the answer is no, then this is not a morally right action, and hence it is not a categorical imperative. In the second example of speaking the truth, we should follow the principle of universality and ask again whether we want speaking the truth to be universalized. So the answer is yes. If the answer is yes, that means speaking the truth, this act of speaking the truth is a categorical imperative and it is morally right. Now, a categorical imperative is a moral principle which must always be followed no matter the consequence. Remember, in the beginning of my lecture, I mentioned that Kant is a deontologist. For him, consequences do not matter. In the first example of stealing the food for feeding the poor, utilitarianism will say that the action of stealing is morally right because it contributes to the greater good. The poor are being fed even though the action is not morally ideal. It is permissible for utilitarianism if it contributes to the greater good. So stealing an act is contributing to the greater good of feeding the poor. So for utilitarianism, consequences matter. But for Kant, who is a deontologist, consequences do not matter. The act of stealing is not permissible under no circumstances. It cannot be universalized. So if it cannot be universalized, we should not do that action. Now, the second formulation of the categorical imperative is the principle of the formula of the N. Act in such a way that you always treat humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of another, not as simply as means, but always at the same time as an end. Let me repeat again. Act in such a way that you always treat humanity, whether in your own person or in the person of another, not as simply as a means, but always at the same time as an end. Now, to understand this, let us see what is means and what is ends. Means here means the things which we do and the stuff we use to accomplish an end. And N here means the things for the sake of which we do stuff. For Kant, a rational or reasonable being should not be used as a means to fulfill another end. Rather, they should be treated as ends themselves. He is not saying that we can never use human being as means. He is merely prohibiting the use of human being merely as a means. Human beings have inherent values and should not be treated as means to a particular end. This is because for Kant, if humans are used as means, they are reduced to a thing. Any act that treats humanity as means is not morally right. That is, it is morally wrong. Now, to understand this second formulation, we will use the previous example which you have used to explain the first formulation, that is the act of stealing. This act of stealing treats someone as means to my selfish end. Therefore, this act is morally wrong. From this, we can understand 2 points. First, we should not treat others or oneself merely as means, and secondly, we should not treat others or oneself as end. So this is the second formulation of the categorical imperative, the principle of the formula of end. Now we'll go to the last one. The third and the last formulation of Kant's categorical imperative is formula of autonomy. One must will something that we could at the same time freely will of ourselves. Let me repeat. We must will something that we could at the same time freely will of oneself. Now, the first two formulations of Kant's categorical imperative are direct. There is no controversy. He claims that the first formulation lays out the objective condition of the categorical imperative, and the second formulation lays out the subjective condition of the categorical imperative, and the result is the formulation of the categorical imperative, which contains the two, the first one and the second one, which is we must will something that we could at the same time freely will of ourselves, which is the third categorical imperative. Nothing else is making us decide other than the sheer fact that it is indeed our duty. This makes it clear that categorical imperative requires autonomy. So these are the three formulations of Kant's categorical imperative. Let me sum up the lecture which I have just given. First, Kant is a deontologist. For him, actions are duty-based and consequences do not matter. And then there are two types of imperative, hypothetical imperative and categorical imperative. Kant formulated three principles to arrive at categorical imperative. They are principle of universality, principle of formula of the end, and principle of formula of autonomy. For any imperative to be categorical imperative, we should first check the principle of universality. That is, we should ask if we want that action to be universalized. If the answer is yes, that action or imperative is morally acceptable. Secondly, the principle of the formula of the end. This means, like, in doing that action, we should not treat others or oneself as a means but as ends. And thirdly, principle of the formula of autonomy. That is, in doing that action, nothing should be guiding or making us decide, but that action should be done out of duty. By following these three principles, Kant says we can arrive that an act is a categorical imperative. This concludes my lecture on Kant's categorical imperative. Thank you.